We're going to start focusing our attention on the Reconstruction period after the United States Civil War. It lasted from even before the Civil War was officially over until the year 1877, which is when the final troops were taken out of the southern states, which marked the end of Reconstruction. First of all, I encourage you to print off these slides. If you go to the website, to your class, you can find this Reconstruction PowerPoint there available for download. I would print it out either in slide view or outline view so that you can take notes on it. Reconstruction was one of the most difficult periods of history that our country has ever gone through because the task at hand was extremely difficult. How exactly were we going to put our country back together after 4 years of a very bloody, intense civil war that put countrymen at each other's throats, basically, brother fighting brother? It's no easy task to put the country back together again as one and to resolve all the issues which started the Civil War. So the first thing that we're going to look at is basically the idea of who is going to be in charge of this process. Would it be the president leading the country in the way, or would it be the Congress, which was made up of representatives and senators from each state, in coming up with the final verdict of how the country should be put back together? So as you can see at the top here, that this was going to be an extremely difficult task. A big reason for that was because the U.S. Constitution, which was created after we gained our independence from the British, provided no firm guidelines as far as, how much should the government go towards securing freedom from former slaves. Slavery itself was abolished with the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, but nowhere in the Constitution itself were there any guidelines on how to put the country back together, because the people who wrote the Constitution had no idea that the country would be torn apart in a civil war and that slavery would be ended. So the idea of coming up with answers to those questions when they had basically nothing to go on was really challenging. Within the Congress and the presidents that were in office during the time of Reconstruction, there were obviously a wide variety of views that were taken on how the South should be treated and brought back into the country. And basically it breaks down into moderate views or minimal views versus radical views. And you can see basically here that these are the difference between the two views. People who were more moderate in nature said that they should focus their attention on the white middle class and helping them to recover economically. They weren't quite as concerned about the rights for newly freed slaves and incorporating them into society. They didn't necessarily believe that there should be a whole lot of changes to the society of the South. They felt that farming and agriculture were fine ways of life to continue with. They just had to figure out how to do that without slaves. And then the radicals were the other group who basically thought that all of Southern society should be completely changed from the inside out. And a big part of that would then obviously be how to make sure that civil rights were given to blacks now that slavery was outlawed. President Lincoln was the first person to address the idea of Reconstruction even before the Civil War was over. And he was wanting the South to come back into the country in an easy, forgiving way. He felt that being more lenient and forgiving toward the South would reduce the amount of tension and bitterness among the Southerners and make the country come back together more quickly. So he came up with what he called his Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction in 1863, which we know was 2 years before the Civil War actually ended in 1865. And basically you can see what the proclamation entailed from the description here. As soon as 10% of the eligible voters in a southern state took a pledge of loyalty, then that state could be readmitted to the Union. There were some groups of individuals that were excluded to taking this oath, but Lincoln did retain the right to give pardons to certain people if he chose to. He basically wanted to make sure that any Confederate leaders that had been really key in making the South go to war would have a lot more restrictions put on them. But basically this was a pretty easy proposal. Only 10% of the voters in a state is not a very big number to require taking this loyalty oath. There were obviously some people who disagreed with Lincoln's views and felt like he was being way too easy on the South and letting them come back in pretty much scot-free and not have any really key punishments given to them. So there were some people in Congress, who is the legislative branch that works with the president in creating laws for our country that the president then enforces. Many congressional members objected to Lincoln's being very easy on the South, and they came up with their own proposal. There was a bill written in 1864, which again was before the Civil War ended, and it was introduced by two individuals whose last names were Wade and Davis. And basically this said that more people should be excluded from taking the oath of loyalty, and that the percentage of people in a state to take the oath should be bumped up to at least 50%. These people in Congress, who were mostly probably what we considered radical, who wanted extreme changes in the South, felt like Lincoln's plan would just make the southern states become like they were before the Civil War, that it would be dominated by government leaders that were all about secession and state rights. So by making 50% of the voters take an oath of loyalty as opposed to 10%, there could be greater assurance that the southern states would fall in line with what the government of the North was wanting them to do. Only non-Confederates who were not a part of the southern state governments before the Civil War would be able to create a new state constitution. Lincoln did not like this idea. He enacted what's called a pocket veto, which is when he let this bill sit on his desk and took no action on it, and therefore it never went into action. But to try to get around the fact that Lincoln didn't act on their idea, some Congress members in 1865 created an agency called the Freedmen's Bureau, which was supposed to help newly freed slaves get on their feet by providing them with education, food, shelter, and other types of aid that would help them start a new life. This was also given to homeless whites that were left homeless because of the fighting in the war. Now let's look at the next person to get involved in this process, President Johnson. We know that President Lincoln was assassinated right at the end of the Civil War, so he never really had the opportunity to carry out his Reconstruction ideas. The man who became president when Lincoln was assassinated was a man by the name of Andrew Johnson. He was a not very well-known person. He was from the state of Tennessee, and he ended up having a serious clash with the members of Congress over who was going to control the country's direction in this Reconstruction period. He very nearly was kicked out of the presidency, and only a few presidents have ever come that close to being what's called impeached. Nixon came close, President Clinton came close, but President Johnson was the first to get this close. You can see a little bit about his background. Being from Tennessee, he was more towards white views that would hold blacks to be inferior. He, because of his background, was from a poor setting, sort of like Lincoln, and so therefore he thought that the most important thing to focus on were the poor whites and the middle class whites in their conflicts that they had with the rich planters of the South. He felt like by helping these lower class whites to gain a step up in society would put the country back together in the right way. You can see here, like I said, he was from Tennessee. He had been a senator, and he remains loyal with the Union, even though he kind of had more Southern views as far as how he viewed black people. He did feel like it was important to keep the country preserved. So that is why he was picked to be Abraham Lincoln's running mate. And hopefully by him being on the ticket with Abraham Lincoln during that first election back in 1860, other people who were had more Southern views, or who at that time were mostly the Democrat Party, would stick with the Union and end up voting Republican instead of keeping with party lines and Democrats, because most of the Southern states were controlled by Democrats before the Civil War. We could even go as far as to say that President Johnson was a white supremacist, and being that we know the radicals from the last screen were all about extreme changes in the South and making sure that newly freed slaves had rights that were equal with whites, he was bound to have some serious clashes with these radicals in Congress. The only reason that President Johnson went along with Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which was given to try to free slaves in the Southern rebellious states, is because he thought that by these slaves becoming free would destroy the rich plantation owner status, because if you remember back here, he was all about the poor and middle class whites. He hated the rich white planters that had controlled the southern states, because he was not one himself. So he wanted to make sure that these people right here were completely destroyed in their standing. So this is basically what his plan was. You can see the outline of it right here. He wanted to make sure that southern states were put under a specific control. You can see the details. They were going to have provisional governors chosen, which were temporary governors, and These would be from prominent Southern politicians from before the Civil War, but had opposed secession and had never served in the Confederacy's military. These temporary governors would be the ones that would call new state constitutional conventions together and make sure that quote-unquote loyal whites were the ones who were allowed to be a part of these conventions and vote for new state constitutions. Obviously, you can see his bias, and he would probably be more likely to decide who was considered a loyal white and who wasn't. He would require the Southern states to take an oath of allegiance, similar to Lincoln and the Wade-Davis bill. He excluded certain people from the right to take these oaths of allegiance, and some of these are similar to the others as well. Confederate leaders and former office holders were not allowed to take the oath of allegiance. And you can see here, going along with his opinion too, any Southerners that were rich prior to the Civil War would not be allowed to vote in the Oath of Loyalty or any new state constitutions as well. And you can kind of see that that reflects his idea that he didn't like the rich whites in the South and wanted to make sure that they were kept down as much as possible. But you notice this little get out clause that Johnson inserted. He could allow certain people that he designated up here and right here the opportunity to take an oath of loyalty by giving them individualized pardons, which is when you give legal forgiveness to someone. He could retain that right if he chose to. And so in making this little get out clause, he actually allowed many former Confederate leaders from before the Civil War to end right back up in the place where they were in the Southern state governments. You can see here that his plan required the new constitutional conventions in these southern states that were going to write the new constitutions to make sure that it was worded that secession was illegal. They would have to make sure that Confederate debt was taken care of from the Civil War. They would have to approve the 13th Amendment, which set all slaves free. But you can see here that states created qualifications on their own. They could limit the right to vote to only whites if they chose to, and Johnson thought that this was important for the southern states to have at least some say in what their new constitution was going to look like. There was a lot of anger over Johnson's plan, especially from the radicals in Congress who wanted to more extreme changes. And another reason for the uneasiness was because in many of the southern states that were set up by Johnson's plan, they passed black codes, which were meant to put all kinds of restrictions and regulations on newly freed blacks. Many Congress members actually thought that they should refuse to accept new Southern House of Representative members and senators that were set up under Johnson's plan because they knew that these people would be creating black codes in their states and just try to keep newly freed slaves down. Here's some examples of what some of the Southern black codes look like. These are from different states in the South that were set up after they were admitted back into the Union under Johnson's plan. And you can see that some of them were about the new working conditions now that slavery was gone. But all of them together, you can read them one by one on your own, were meant to keep blacks in their quote-unquote place in society. So basically, given what we know about President Johnson and how he was more concerned with lower and middle-class whites as opposed to African Americans, and we know that Congress was more concerned with these newly freed slaves and making sure that they had civil rights, obviously there was going to be some severe competition and conflict between these two groups. And it came down to the fact that one defied the other. So in the next recording, we'll be looking at how the Congress tried to take over control of Reconstruction by taking things out of President Johnson's hand, which led to some serious outbreaks of violence and mudslinging and all kinds of political tactics being implemented on both sides. But in the end, it comes down to who was going to get more of what they wanted from the South in this newly recreated United States of America.